like adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators. When students begin adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, it can get a little tougher. So today we are going to talk about how do we teach students what's the best way for adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. I'm Allison Dowda from A Double Dose of Dowda, and I can't wait to get started. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the progression of the standards. So this idea of where are students coming from before they get to this skill, and then where are they going after this skill. For most states, the ones that base their standards off of the Common Core standards, in third grade, students only begin with basic fractions. They get their introductions, they do equivalent fractions, identifying fractions, that sort of thing. Now in fourth grade, that's when most states have students adding fractions and mixed numbers with like denominators only. In fifth grade, they begin adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. When we're introducing this to students, we want to take a research-based approach. And the best approach for teaching mathematics to students is to take the CRA method. Now, the CRA method is this. It is the concrete, representational, abstract model. For concrete, that means that we are giving students opportunities to get their hands on something. They're going to be using manipulatives, they are going to be touching it and just better understanding how it works. For representational, this is where they can move to taking those experiences that they had that were hands-on and instead representing them. So perhaps through pictures or number lines, it's going to be a very visual model. Lastly is the abstract model. Now, for abstract, that means that they are strictly working with equations or algorithms. They do not have a hands-on component or even a visual component to this. For adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, during concrete, we are going to talk about how to use pattern blocks and fraction bars to teach adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators in a way that students will understand the concept of what they are actually doing whenever we get to the part later about changing to common denominators. Representational, we are going to use pictures and number lines. And for abstract, we are just going to use written equations without any other additional helps. As you work through this CRA model with your students, it's important to mention that you need to give students time to work through each approach. So in that case, that means some students may need more time with hands-on. Some students may be able to jump very quickly to representational. Just know that I would not do all three of these in the same lesson. This is something that's going to take time, and one is going to build on top of the other. We want to give them a good foundation. So let's jump in and see how this would look. These are my two favorite hands-on manipulatives for students when it comes to working with fractions. The first set of manipulatives that I love, and these are my absolute favorite, are fraction bars, or sometimes they are called fraction tiles. If you don't have fraction tiles or fraction bars available, you might be able to find pattern blocks somewhere in your building, even if you borrow from another teacher. These to me are still a great way for talking about fractions, and these are what I used before I wrote a grant for my classroom and got a classroom set of the fraction bars, fraction tiles. I spoke a little bit more about these in detail in the previous video of adding fractions with like denominators. And so now we are going to talk about how to use these to help students add fractions and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. And we are ready to get started. Now, again, if you watched my first video, you know that whenever I introduce adding fractions and subtracting fractions to students, I don't begin by talking about fractions. Instead, I begin talking about just everyday items. So for instance, if I have one eraser and I add 2 erasers, how many erasers do I have? Students will tell me I have 3 erasers. Hopefully, they'll remember that conversation. The next thing that I would do for introducing fractions with unlike denominators and how we work with those is I would ask them, if I have 1 eraser and I add a paper clip, what do I have? hopefully they will, after maybe perhaps a couple of creative responses, they will come up with, well, we just have one eraser and one paperclip, which is exactly what we want them to come up with. We are going to tell them that with fractions, we can make some changes to fractions so that we can actually combine those things that aren't the same. So the very first thing that I want to do is working with the fraction bars, starting with our concrete learning for adding fractions with unlike denominators. You don't have to have students keep their one whole, but I personally like to have the one whole there just always as a point of reference. Let's say that I'm going to have students add 1/3 and 1/6. So I'm going to ask students to get 1/3 and 1/6. And I'm going to ask them, okay guys, what is 1/3 plus 1/6? Well, remember the paperclip and the eraser? Remember how those don't go together because we're talking about two different things? I want to ask them to come up with what is a creative solution for something that we could do to make these the same, but still equal to this same amount. And so I would give them a moment to play around with that. Hopefully they've had lots of work already with equivalent fractions and they know those well. And hopefully they are quick to come up with, well, if I do this, that can work. And I would ask them, does that give me the same distance? Is it for sure the same amount? Which it is. And so can we do something with this now? And hopefully they will say, yes, of course we can do something with this. So instead of thinking about this as 1/3 plus 1/6, I will ask them to rename it for me as 2/6 plus 1/6. And in that case, what do we have? We have 3/6, which they see very easily with this, and that's fantastic. That's what we want them to do, is to have that quick win. Now, the next piece of this is that we do want to have it in simplest form. Hopefully students are already introduced some to simplest form, but if not, you can just quickly explain that we want an equivalent fraction, and their challenge is to give me an equivalent fraction for 3/6 using as few pieces as possible, as few tiles as possible. So after you give them a moment and they can work in a group, they will see that 3/6 is the same as 1/2. So that was how we first started to solve this. Instead of saying 1/3 plus 1/6, we want them to do 1/3 minus 1/6. We want to take this amount away. And so we need to ask them to come up with a way to explain how we can take away 1/6 from 1/3, and we can know with confidence what the answer is going to be here. So in this case, you would give them time to play around with their fraction tiles, and we have 1/6, and 1/6 is the same as 1/3. So now when I take away 1/6 from the 1/3, what do I have left? I have left 1/6. Now for some students, it might be helpful to leave the 1/3 there. For some students though, what might happen is they might say, okay, I took away 1/6 and now I have 1/3 and 1/6. No, that's not what we want to do. So what you can do instead is you can have students, sometimes if it's subtraction, I will have them stack on top for their equivalent fractions, and you can do that for addition as well, but stack on top so we can see when we take away 1/6. Sometimes I'll have them trade it out. So instead of stacking it, we will just discuss, okay, we agree that 2/6 is the same as 1/3, so we swapped it out and got rid of it. Now let's take away 1/6. So depending on your students, different students may require that to look a little bit different for them. So be aware of that. So that is adding and subtracting unlike denominators with fraction bars. Now let's take a look at pattern blocks. So pattern blocks, again, you are a little bit more limited on what you can have students work with as far as the fractions go, because you are going to be limited to halves, thirds, which are these blues that I'm putting together now, and sixth. And I'm not going to take the time right now to put these all together, but it takes 6 greens to equal 1 whole. And now with pattern blocks, let's say that for this problem, I want to add 1/2 and 1/6. Now, again, I do prefer to have students stack on top of a whole, just because that makes sure that things get lined up, especially with the greens and the blues whenever we're using those. So I would ask students, okay guys, let's put together 1/2 plus 1/6. What do we have here? And so they might come up with some answers, but the question is, okay, but how do we know for sure what it's going to be? So again, we want them to recognize, okay, we need something. We can't have a paper clip and an eraser. We need it all to be the same. So in this case, is there a way that we can make them all reds, or a way that we can make them all greens, or is there something else that we can use? With pattern blocks, again, pick your problems carefully, but on this one, they should be able to tell us that we can do a trade. The red piece is the same as 3 greens. And so I traditionally want them to show that to me before they can make a trade. And so what was my 1/2 plus 1/6 is now, I can see, 4/6. All right, so now let's say that I want to subtract. And in this case, I am going to have them do 1/2, the red, minus the 1/6. Now, in this case, sometimes kids will want to put the green on here and then, take it away as 1/6, and then they're left with a half. That's, of course, not what we want them to do. So be careful. Make sure that with subtraction, you don't have students physically add to their pieces the part that is going to be taken away. But instead, I would have them say, okay, I want to take away the 1/6. What am I left with? Now, again, we don't know for sure what's left. So I want to ask them, is there a way that we can either make both of these size pieces all reds or all greens? And they will tell me that we can make the red into greens. Again, you can stack them on top like this, or you can have students do the fair trade and take away the red for the 3 greens, which I'm going to do just for space right now. All right, so now 1/2 is the same as 3/6. Now, can we take away 1/6? Yes, we certainly can. And when I take away 1/6, and it doesn't matter which one they take away, and I point that out to them, though I do like to point out, guys, would it make sense for us to take away this piece in the middle? Can that cause a little bit of confusion? And it can. So instead, we're just going to take one off the end, take off 1/6. And here we are with 2/6. Now again, challenge time. I ask them, is there a way that we can rename these 2 greens into just one piece that is exactly the same amount? And so let them explore a little bit. Again, they're limited on this one, but there we have one blue piece. The 1/3 piece is the same as the 2/6 piece. So now they can tell me 2/6, or they can tell me 1/3 as we are just getting started, because we don't want to, some kids may not be ready right away to jump to the 1/3, especially if they're kids that have trouble with equivalent fractions. But if they can do this part, then that's a big win. So we don't want to take that away. We don't want to jump to this too soon. Just make sure that you are monitoring students and their needs. So that's how we do this with the pattern blocks. All right, the next piece is to talk about how we would represent. So we are talking about pictures and we are talking about number lines. In this case, I have 1/3 and I want to add 1/6 to it. So what I'm going to do is, if I have 1/3 plus 1/6, let's say that on this one I am going to use circles. I tend to do circles because they're just easier, but you can do squares or whatever you like. So I am going to draw 1/3. So I have 1/3 and I need to take away 1/6. So I would have the conversation with the students of, okay, guys, let's consider what if this were one of these pieces. And you know what I would do with this? I would absolutely not care one bit if students wanted to trace this, because again, sometimes some students, to jump from the hexagon to the circle may be a little confusing for them. So let's say in this case, I have 1/3. You can also get lovely marker on yourself. No big deal. It'll wash off. Okay, so I have 1/3. And now I tell the students, we want to take away 1/6. Now I will ask them, should we draw a 6th on here? Is that what we're needing to do? We want them to respond after they think about it for a little bit. We certainly want them to respond with no. We do not want for them to draw this extra piece on here. Instead, we want to take this away. So we can have the conversation with them of, okay, what could we do to take that piece away? How do we have to split this up? So they can see, hopefully, they'll remember from the drawing, we are going to split it. And I like to use dotted lines and have students use dotted lines too. If it's not perfect, that is completely fine. So now, can I take away that green piece? And I have them put an X over top, and yes, I can. What's left? I have 1/6 left, and matches up just like that. Same thing with this drawing. I can ask them, how can we get equal size pieces and then take one away, and what are we left with? So that's how we can do this visually with drawing pictures. What I really love about this strategy is how it really takes students from the concrete to the representational. If they are struggling, this is going to be a key piece to help them make that jump. Now, the next piece that I want to talk about is a number line. Again, students really can have trouble with number lines, especially with drawing their own number lines. Who wants to mess with that? So if you have fraction bars, this is what I like to do with fraction bars. I like to have students make their own number line based off of the fraction bars. So I have my number line here, and there's a 1 on that end. And let's say that on this problem, I want students to do 1/2 plus 1/6. So I'm going to do 1/2, which they can see here, plus 1/6. So the question is, on this one, what is 1/2 plus 1/6? We'll have a conversation about why this is a difficult problem when we're looking at it on this number line, what's missing on here. And what we want them to notice is that we can, the way the number line is drawn right now, we can jump from 0 to 1/2, but then there's this weird one here, and then there's one whole. So what we want to do, the challenge is there a way that we can get a number line set up correctly. And so after a little bit of exploring, and again, this is one, if they don't get this on their own, then have them go back to the big fraction bars, have them do it with the concrete, because what we want them to find and discover is, well, I can do a sixth here. What could I do here? So we want them to put their sixth here and divide their number line into sixths. So now I can renumber my number line. I have 1/6, 2/6, 3/6, 4/6. And now for me, I would absolutely have them go ahead and, I mean, we can't just leave it like this, right? So we need to be able to see, they need to see one whole, and they need to see 5/6, and we can have them write 6/6. So now we can talk about this number line, and if we had 1/2, which is what we started off with, plus 1/6. Well, again, if they need to pull that out and see, there's our 1/6 jump. Our answer is 4/6. Now again, I might ask them, okay guys, challenge in as few pieces as possible. What's a simpler way to write this? Now you'll have some kids who will be able to go straight from 4/6 is the same as 2/3 because they understand equivalent fractions. But for your kids that don't, tell them in as few pieces as possible, make this same amount. And so then they can stack up their 1/3 and their other 1/3, and they will see that that is 2/3. So I might put equals 2/3. Lastly, for the number line, let's talk about this. So we talked about adding on the number line. Same thing for subtracting on the number line. On this one, let's say instead of 1/2 plus 1/6, we did 1/2 minus 1/6. We would have them go through this same process and then make the jump backwards to 2/6. Again, challenge time. Few pieces as possible. Who can make it in as few pieces as possible? That would be 1/3. All right. Lastly, we are ready to move on to the traditional method of adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators. Now, if you are like me, this is the only method you ever got to see. So in this case, let's say that I was asking students to add 1/3 plus 1/6. All right. In these cases, we need to, again, whatever you're using, I'm going to say paper clips and erasers. Guys, we have a paper clip and an eraser here. They're not the same. Thirds and sixths cannot be combined like they are. So we need to make them into something new, something that can be the same denominator for both of them. So this is where you have the conversations with them about least common multiples and how we are going to list. I like to have students list the multiples of 3 and the multiples of 6. I do physically have them do this on paper because I think that just gets better results for them. It makes them slow down a little bit and not rush. So I'm going to list the multiples of 3, and I'm going to show them how to do this. 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 3 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 3 is 12. 5 times 3 is 15. And I'll tell them, do a few, because we don't want to have to do too many. So we'll just do a few at a time. So then we'll do the sixes. And so the multiples of 6 are 6, 12, 18, 24, 30. So I listed the first few there. I will tell them, okay guys, which ones do we have in common? What do they both have? Well, they both have 12. So I'm going to circle those. And they both have 6. So I'm going to circle those. So I'm going to tell them we want the smallest one possible, because as mathematicians, we can be a little lazy sometimes. We want the easiest, quickest way to do something. So 6 is what we're wanting. We need to set up equivalent fractions so that the denominators are 6th. They have to understand we are not looking to change the values of either fraction. We still need, and I would pull these out, we still need 1/3 plus 1/6. Well, the easy one here, 1/6 to 1/6, did that make any changes? No. So that one will stay the same, 1/6. But now we need our 1/3, instead of being a third, we need it to be 1/6. But we need it to be the same amount. It has to equal the same thing. So they can use their fraction bars if they need that to get started. And this is a great way to move them toward this, is how many 6ths does it take to equal a third? Well, it equals 2/6 to equal 1/3. Now, in this conversation, what I talk to kids about is how we're doing equivalent fractions. So 3 times 2 is 6. Whatever you do to one, you have to do the same thing to the other. We have 2/6 because we multiplied the numerator and the denominator by 2. Now, what do we have? We have fractions with like denominators. And we know exactly what to do with fractions with like denominators. We leave the denominator the same, and we just add the numerators. Because now, 2/6 plus 1/6, that's 2 erasers plus 1 eraser, equals 3 erasers. 3/6. This is hopefully a conversation that you've already had with students, and they will be able to quickly arrive at 3/6 is the same as 1/2. It works the same way for subtraction. But again, I like to pull in the fraction bars as we're doing this the first time or two, and as they're listing their multiples. I like to identify for any new concept, what are the milestones? This is the new learning, so I understand the steps that students have to be able to do in order to complete these problems, and so I can pinpoint what students might be having trouble with. So the first milestone, the first new concept we're going to be talking about with adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators is that they have to be able to identify the least common multiples of the denominators so that they can make the least common denominator. That's the first milestone. The second milestone, the thing that students need to be able to know how to do well, is equivalent fractions. We need to make sure that they can convert fractions to equivalent fractions that have the same denominators from the first step. The third component is, can they add and subtract just the numerator? And then lastly, they need to be able to put their answers in simplest form. So those are our 4 milestones. The next part to talk about is differentiation. So what if students are having trouble? Now, if you keep those milestones in mind, that's going to be helpful in understanding where students need some supports, but perhaps their problems go even before this concept of adding and subtracting with unlike denominators. Maybe it goes back to 3rd or 4th grade issues that need to be cleaned up. So for intervention for these students, if they are struggling, they may need to review some basic fractions concepts. They may need to review adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators. And lastly, equivalent fractions. This is probably the most common area that students will need intervention, is with equivalent fractions. Now, let's say that for differentiation, you've got some students who need a little bit of a challenge. They're able to do this well, and so we want to throw something a little bit bigger at them. So the first challenge is, early on, you want to make sure that students can come up with sums that are greater than 1 whole. If you are using smaller fractions, in this case, make them larger fractions, and you can go ahead and throw in mixed numbers if they're ready. The second part of this for differentiating for students who need a little bit more of a challenge is to add and subtract 3 or more fractions. So rather than having 2 add-ins in the problem, make it 3 or more. When it comes to practicing these skills, I have put together a bundle of some of my favorite activities to use with students for adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. It has 7 resources in it. There are 2 matching games, 2 worksheets, 2 bingos, and an anchor chart. So let's take a look at those really quickly. I have 2 worksheets for adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators in these worksheet mazes. These are a lot of fun for students to be able to work through and a little different than the traditional worksheet. Next, I have included 2 adding fractions and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators bingos. So this is a great activity if you have a sub especially, or something that students will just enjoy doing in class and they'll ask to do over and over. Next, I have sets of adding fractions with unlike denominators and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators as matching games. And there are 3 levels to each of these sets of matching cards. So there's a below level, just getting started, there's an on level, and then there's a challenge that actually in each of these sets includes word problems. And then lastly, I have an anchor chart for adding and subtracting fractions that you can use as just a 1-page handout. You can print it as half pages, which are included, so they are perfect for interactive notebooks. And I have poster versions as well that take 4 pages to print, and you have a nice large poster version of this anchor chart. So all of these activities are super easy to put together, and I think your students will enjoy them. Check the link in the description for access to this bundle. Also, you can check the description for a link to a free teaching guide that I have included. Everything that we have talked about, it's just a little 1-page sheet that gives all the information so that you will be prepared for whenever you need to teach adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. I hope this helps you get started, and I would love to hear your feedback on how this goes when you use it with your students.
As always, thanks for watching, and we would love for you to subscribe to our channel.